The work week is here. Let's begin with your Monday market preview with Annex Wealth Management CEO Dave Spano on Point Taken.
Ooh, I like this new opening for the one, the only, Mr. Dave Spano, who's not only on the phone with us, but if you were watching the YouTube stream, he is also on video. Looking good, Dave. How you doing?
Well, not as good as you, but yes, thank you.
All right, I hear before we get into markets and 50-year mortgages, you're going to go to the game tonight?
I'm supposed to go to the game tonight. I have to make sure that I'm dressed properly to stand outside for a number of hours in 28-degree weather. So, Steve, are you going?
Yeah, and if you are outside, text me and I'll wave to you from the warm inside.
See, that we're not a real fan. Not a real fan.
I've done it both ways.
Yeah, I'm going to have a knit cap and gloves on, I'm sure.
You're going to need it. It's supposed to be, I think, 29 at game time, going down to about 17 at some point.
Good
Which is
Lord.
perfect for football.
All right, let's get into I mean, there's so much to talk about between the shutdown, but I also think there's been a shift that seems like after last week's elections, President Trump is thinking more about the A word, right? Affordability. But one of the things that came out was this idea of a 50-year mortgage instead of a 30-year mortgage. And I get that the monthly, in the short term, your monthly payment is lower, but seeing some of the numbers of how much you end up paying the bank, why is this a good idea?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So think about 50 years. I don't know how old you have to be to get a 50-year mortgage. I am pretty sure I don't got 50 years left. However, you think about, the payment will be lower, and so that does make it more affordable and more flexible for someone who wants more house or be able to get into a house. I get all of that. But then if you put the positives and then next to it the negatives, there's a ton of that. And if you look at the difference, as you point out, between a 30-year and a 50-year, it is, 10 or 15% less. But if you run the numbers, the interest rate is almost 2x to what you would pay from a 30 to a 50.
So it seems like it's good for the banks, but I don't know if it's good for home buyers.
What's the policy play for the president here? I don't get it.
Well, again, affordability. And you look at what people as Kristen put. Well, it's lowering the payment. So it does lower the payment, and that means that more people are allowed to get into a home versus rent, and that's probably the argument. And if you look at affordability and talk about what is the number, housing represents about 30 to 35% of people's costs. And so if you can lower that payment even in a minor way, and by the way, Steve, a lot of people don't hold their mortgages for 30 years. And so they're going to trade out of it, they're going to upgrade, they're going to refinance, all of those things. So in the short term, it might get you into the house, but in the long term, it would cost you more. But, you remember back in the day, you used to burn your mortgages when you got them paid off, right? So that was a big day. And just as a financial planning axiom, if you can get out at some point and get out and not have a mortgage, that's a substantial financial planning play.
Dave Spano joining us on WTMJ's Point Taken. All right, so we know that the shutdown deal is in the works. A lot of announcements last night, a lot of people pontificating, at least elected officials pontificating today about that. What's your take on how this deal might play out and what the impact on the economy and the markets will be?
Well, if it's a clean CR that's been out there right now, and it's and I'm sure you've covered this already today, it's the idea or promise that there will be a vote on ACA subsidies extension. So we'll see if that happens. I mean, that would be a big promise broke if they don't have that conversation. But, it's likely that these things happen in bunches. In other words, you get a clean CR through January, and then you're right up against it again and have these problems again. But you've got Thanksgiving coming up. You talk about motivations to get this thing done. You've got Thanksgiving coming up, the biggest travel day, and you can see already the number of delays and cancellations. And we're not even close to getting out there yesterday. I know both of my kids were flying yesterday, and they got delayed, and then one actually got canceled. So if you think about trying to get home for and by the way, that might be a champagne problem, but there's no question that travel is part of it. But then you look at putting SNAP benefits back into place, putting some government workers back on payroll. These are significant things in the meantime, to get away from the leverage that both sides want to get this deal done, to really come down to these ACA subsidies.
So we talked last week when you were on about the K economy, which I heard. It was funny. It was one of those things where you hear it once and then you hear it for the rest of the week, and you're constantly hearing it.
That's because we set it up, Kristen. You and I.
We set the trend.
They never heard of it between our conversation.
Exactly. And so, but then the day after you were on, the Tuesday night elections happened, and so much of that conversation was around affordability. So let's say shutdown is over, Congress gets back to work. What are some of the actual functional policies that Congress could have in their control to start fixing the affordability problem and some of these trends with the lower part of the K to even out to the upper part of the K? Is there something they could be working on?
And I guess that's really just a philosophical question. I mean, can government fix all of your problems, right? And so I can argue that your education affects your income. There's been papers written about this for 50 years, right? And the higher you get in education, the higher your median annual income goes up. There's just a ton of evidence on that, right? And so education is clearly part of that. That's number one. Number two, this conversation about healthcare has got to happen. I mean, I don't care where you are in your income strata, healthcare is an issue in this country, and it's been that way. I mean, I can remember Clinton talking about this, and that's 30 years ago. And so, what benefit? What have we made? What strides have we made? So, more technology probably could be in there. So, healthcare could be a policy issue that for sure could fix affordability. Education, getting people more access to higher education and better schools. But prescription drugs and telehealth and artificial intelligence, perhaps, in the healthcare field. All of these are measurable, logical conversations that could happen. Will they happen is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. Dave, you and I talked about this before, and it's, it sort of looks back at the history of the market and bubbles and what people are worried about. And the AI question comes up a lot. I read a lot about and watch a lot about AI and how it's sort of taking over. If a few firms dominate the market, and we all know the names, right? Does the market essentially become so sensitive to their outcomes and their business that it sort of jeopardizes what we know as the strength of the markets, where there was some diversity before?
Yeah, and that is true. So that Mag 7 that you're talking about, and all the big names, do represent about 30% of the capitalization of the market. So when they move back and forth, it does affect the market as a whole. But you look at the Mag 7, for example, the NASDAQ was down about 3.5% last year. But I always say, and I say this, is put it in perspective. So the NASDAQ is now up about 20%. Even though it was down 3.5% last week, it's still up 20% year to date in 2025. 2024, it was up 30%. In 2023, it was up 42%. And so that is substantial. You add those three together, NASDAQ almost doubling in the last 3 years. So yes, there's no question that it does affect the market, and yes, it's gone well, but there are other parts of the economy that did not, or part of the markets that did not go down last week. And that's the reason why you have diversification. And that's the reason why you should rebalance when you get to this point. If it's overweighted in one particular area, this is the time to look at it and rebalance, especially as we go into the end of the year.
Since you asked, real quick, I know Kristen wants to ask a question. The rebalance question comes up a lot. How often should you be considering that sort of re-look at your finances? Yeah,
and it should not be a calendar. I think I'm fundamentally opposed to those who say every quarter end we're going to rebalance. It's really a bad time to do it, by the way. It should be on some parameters. It has, for example, if you have tech in your portfolio, instead of being whatever it should be, 5 or 10%, it's become 20%. That's the time to rebalance back to the middle. So it shouldn't be based on a calendar. It should be based more on math.
This was just a follow-up to the AI question. As far as last week, Sam Altman, he kind of was playing. He was using vague words, but trying to talk to the U.S. government about the possibility of federal loan guarantees to spur construction for chip factories, not for data centers, but chip factories. And he got some pushback as far as how much should the government be subsidizing or bailing out, potentially, OpenAI or AI in general. What are you looking for or watching for in that conversation as far as government's involvement with some of these AI companies?
Well, it's a slippery slope, right? But it hasn't been without precedent before. And you can think about, for example, automakers. The government has been in ownership of automakers. It has been in ownership of mortgage companies, right, in FHA. But you look at those things right now and say, at what point is it overstepping? But I do theoretically like the idea, instead of making it a grant, is that we participate in the upside. So there are companies, and you can go back and look, that said the government made a loan, and then when it came due, they got made whole. Us taxpayers, all of us got made whole. So conceptually, it's a good idea, but there's no question it's a slippery slope. So whatever side of the aisle that you're on, you say, okay, that's a good idea. But when the shoe is on the other side, they're going to make you do this and this and invest in these other companies that may be, socially conscious or whatever. Pick an argument of topic. That's where it becomes a slippery slope. So if it becomes transparent and you can say we can make that instead of making a loan or a grant, we can make it equity participation, and the taxpayers will be made whole. I think that's a valuable conversation to have.
Hey, real quick before we wrap it up, any concern that some of the government numbers that we all rely on, and a lot of the decision makers rely on, are not going to be available for the Fed or other agencies to make those big grand decisions for the country? Yeah,
you think about, are we in a holding pattern? And a lot of the data that we get, Steve, is not from the federal government. Yes, the Federal Reserve definitely needs it because they look in the rearview mirror. But I always say who's a better arbiter is really the market, right? Because the companies come out and they have feet on the ground. The CEOs say, this is what's happening in our company. Let me tell you about what happened last quarter and what we see happening. And that's the reason why you can go without it. It shouldn't be a forever thing. But the market is a better arbiter, I think, than looking backwards in the rearview mirror.
All right.
Don't forget, we got a year-end tax planning webinar next Tuesday, I believe the 18th, 1 p.m. I'll be out there with your guys talking about all the things you got to think about this time of year. That's a year-round conversation, but
for sure,
especially focused now. Dave Spano, always appreciate your wisdom. CEO at Annex Wealth.
All right, nice to see you guys. Thanks.